The night sky above Charleston cracked with fireworks on the 4th of July, 1833. Cannons boomed, brass bands marched through the streets, and white men toasted their liberty with wine. But inside the Whitaker estate, a different kind of celebration was unfolding. By dawn, 12 of the most powerful plantation masters in South Carolina would lie dead, their faces frozen in shock, their voices silenced forever. No gunfire, no rebellion, no open fight. Their killer wielded no blade, no musket. He needed only a kitchen patience and the kind of knowledge passed down through generations. His name was Samuel. For 2 decades he had bent over their pots, fed their cravings, endured their laughter as the whip split his back and swallowed his rage as they tore away everyone he loved. To them, Samuel was invisible, just another servant in the shadows. But he remembered. He remembered their weaknesses, their ailments, their indulgences, and he turned every detail into a weapon. That night, when they raised their glasses to freedom, Samuel served justice, 12 plates of it, one for each man who believed he owned the lives of others. This is not merely a tale of poison. It is the story of how memory can become sharper than any blade, how silence can grow louder than any war cry, and how one enslaved cook turned the kitchen into a battlefield. Before we step into this chilling story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you live? Long before the Whitaker estate knew his name, Samuel belonged to another world. He was born beneath a sky alive with storms in a village where thunder spoke louder than drums. His mother, Neafula, was a healer, a woman who bent leaves to her will and read the language of roots as though they were scripture. To the villagers, she was half woman, half mystic, her garden thick with plants that could soothe pain or stop a heartbeat. She cradled wounds with smoke and song, and when children fell ill, she boiled remedies that tasted like earth and survival. Samuel did not cry when he entered the world. Neafula said it meant he had already heard what the earth whispered and found it cruel. He was frail in bone but sharp in mind. While other boys wrestled in the dust, Samuel crouched beside his mother, watching her slice bark and whisper to bowls of steaming water. She taught him that medicine and poison were siblings born from the same soil, wearing the same green. He who controls what goes into the body, she told him, controls the soul. At first he laughed at her words, but they would never leave him. Then came the boats, wooden prisons with sails like vultures. The iron was cold, but the silence of the ship was colder. Samuel watched his mother's chains sway empty one night, her body gone without farewell. No scream, no trace, only absence like a missing tooth your tongue cannot stop searching for. At 10 years old, Samuel arrived in Charleston alone, stripped of his name, branded with another Samuel. The new name was too small for him, like a garment sewn for someone else. The Whitakers did not need another child in the fields. They saw the boy's small frame, his quick eyes, and sent him into the kitchen. There heat roared like a furnace, smoke stung the lungs, and the air smelled of blood, sweat, and salt. For those outside the kitchen seemed softer than the fields, a place of privilege. But Samuel knew better. It was a prison disguised as comfort, a theater of humiliation. Every dish was a reminder of who ate and who starved, who lived in linen and who sweated in chains. At first, Samuel scrubbed pots, ran errands, fetched water. He kept his head down, but nothing escaped his notice. He learned the hierarchy of food: roasted pheasant glazed with figs for the masters, scraps of cornmeal and fatback for the enslaved. He saw how one man's indulgence was another's starvation. The head cook, Miss Gertie, a freed woman in name, only ruled the kitchen with iron ladles and quick tempers. When hot fat splattered across Samuel's hand, she expected screams. Instead, the boy bit down hard and stared back, eyes smoldering with something older than his years. She never struck him again. Instead, she began to teach him crudely, harshly, but thoroughly. He learned how to season meat until it dripped with arrogance, how to slice onions faster than tears could fall, how to bake bread that would be praised at tables where prayers ended with chains. And in the cracks of her lessons, she whispered truths sharper than knives. Watch them eat. They show you who they are with every bite. Samuel watched. He watched Master Edwin Whitaker chew, always on his left side, his right jaw swollen with rot. He watched Judge Hartley push aside pickled beets, claiming pride in his allergy. He watched Mr. Lambert drink warm wine before supper to calm his stomach, bloated from years of indulgence. Samuel remembered every detail as if reciting psalms to himself at night while the coals died and silence swallowed the estate. But Samuel was not just learning recipes. He was building a ledger inside his mind, an invisible account of ailments, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Each symptom was a crack in the armor of men who believed themselves untouchable. He did not write on paper. His memory was his parchment, his patience, the ink. The kitchen became his cage and his laboratory. He understood that fire could both nourish and destroy, that a single leaf could cure a fever or still a heartbeat. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, grinding became more than chores. They were rehearsals for something unspoken, something that lived deep in his bones. While the Whitakers and their guests laughed over silver platters, Samuel studied them the way a falcon studies prey before the strike. He memorized not just what they ate, but how they ate, what they craved, what they feared, what left them vulnerable. It was in the curl of a lip, the wheeze of a breath, the wince after swallowing. Details invisible to men who saw themselves as gods, but not to the boy who fed them. He was still a child when Miss Gertie collapsed by the oven chest, clenched breath gone. No prayer, no scream, just silence. By morning, Samuel wore her apron, not out of trust but necessity. He was there, and no one else would bear the heat. The kitchen was now his. The hearth became both altar and weapon. The enslaved whispered that Samuel was lucky to be spared the fields, but Samuel knew luck had nothing to do with it. He was in the belly of the beast, watching it feed, learning how to make it choke. Every meal became a ritual of observation. He stirred with precision, but his eyes never rested. Each time he served a dish, he weighed what power tasted like, what cruelty chewed on, what justice might someday be disguised as. The memory of Neofula's garden lingered inside him. The whispers of herbs, the riddles of poison, the truth that what enters the body can command the soul. And so Samuel lived in two worlds at once. Outwardly, the obedient cook apron, tied eyes lowered, delivering oysters and cakes to men who would not remember his face. Inwardly, the archivist of their frailties, the silent witness of their arrogance, the son of a healer whose lessons grew darker with each passing season. By the time he was 12, Samuel no longer looked like a child. The heat had hardened his skin, the smoke had lined his eyes with shadows, and the weight of memory had aged his silence. They called him kitchen hand, thinking it a promotion, a gift. But Samuel knew better. The kitchen was not a promotion. It was the forge where patience turned to steel, where silence sharpened into a blade, and where vengeance, slow and careful, began to take root, like seeds in fertile ground. The Whitaker estate was a world of endless labor and silence, but sometimes silence cracks even in the darkest of places. Samuel first saw her through the smoke of the kitchen window. She was carrying a sack of rice nearly as heavy as her body, trudging barefoot through the mud. Rain fell in sheets, and the swollen fields shimmered like mirrors of misery. The other enslaved women whispered and laughed, certain she would not last the week. But she did, and she did not bend. Her name was Adira. In her mother's tongue it meant strength, though here strength was not a virtue but a curse. She was maybe 16, maybe older, no one knew. Her skin was the color of cinnamon bark, her eyes refusing to drop even when the overseer barked orders. Pride burned in her like a lantern in a storm. She was assigned to the drying sheds where her hands split open daily from cracking rice husks. Blood streaked her palms, but she never complained. At night, when the quarters whispered with drums and prayers, Adira did not dance or sing. She stood beneath the old fig tree, staring at the sky as if demanding answers from it. Samuel watched her in secret from the shadows of the kitchen step, apron-stained hands blistered from fire. For weeks he never spoke. What words could survive in a place where silence itself was law? But one night he offered her a scrap of roasted yam still warm from the coals. She did not smile. She only took it, and that was enough. Their bond grew like weeds through cracks, quiet, stubborn, impossible to kill. They had no letters, no courtship, no songs. Their romance was smuggled in glances at the well in hands, brushing against each other like contraband in whispers passed under storms when no one else could hear. Samuel told her of his mother, the healer who whispered to leaves. Adira told him of a brother sold south, gone into Louisiana's sugar fields, his name erased from the ledgers but never from her memory. One night, rain slashed against the roof and thunder rolled like cannons. They stood together beneath the kitchen, Eve's breaths close enough to feel. Adira leaned into him and whispered, "They think we are soil, but we remember the sky." Samuel did not sleep that night. Not because of the storm, but because for the first time since childhood something bloomed in him that was not rage. But the world of the Whitakers devoured everything it touched. 2 weeks later, Adira was gone. Not dead, not whipped, simply gone. Sold, they said, to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. No warning, no goodbye. Just her name scratched out in the estate's ledger as though she had never existed. When Samuel asked why, the overseer smirked. "She don't look down when she talk. Pride don't pick rice." For 2 days, Samuel said nothing. He cooked as usual, moved as usual, kept his silence like a shroud. But on the 3rd day, he began to collect things. A certain mold from the rice barrels, a bark that dried black as ash, a root that smelled of iron when crushed. He ground them into a powder with a stone slow and steady, and buried the pouch beneath the fig tree where Adira once stood. He spoke no words, but the act itself was a vow. That was the beginning. Samuel continued his duties. He He prepared pork stew with cornbread, roasted duck with glazed apples, oysters chilled in bowls of cracked ice. The masters praised his meals, licking grease from their fingers, toasting with wine. Samuel bowed his head, silent as always, but inside he was boiling. Each dish he served was an exercise in restraint. Every glance at the dining table was a reminder that vengeance ripens slowly like rice in the flooded fields. In the months that followed, Samuel often returned to the fig tree at night. He pressed his hand against its rough bark and thought of Adira's eyes fixed on the sky. He imagined her hands bleeding in Louisiana's cane fields, imagined the chains rattling around her ankles, the overseer's whip slicing the air. He imagined her voice whispering again, "We remember the sky." The thought kept him alive, but it also transformed him. He began to see the kitchen not as a prison but as a forge. Every herb, every spice, every dish became a tool. He experimented carefully. A rat that had stolen grain fell twitching by the hearth. A stray dog that tormented children in the quarters grew sick and died after licking a discarded scrap. Samuel studied each death, memorizing symptoms as if they were recipes. He recorded nothing on paper. His memory was sharper than ink, safer than parchment. The masters never noticed. Why would they? To them, Samuel was still invisible, just another set of hands feeding their appetites. But invisibility was his armor. With every unnoticed glance, every remembered weakness, every stolen fragment of knowledge, he was shaping himself into something else, not a servant, but a weapon carved from patience. Adira's absence became the soil in which his vengeance grew. Her name was no longer scratched from a ledger. It was carved into his memory with fire. Samuel promised himself that one day the men who laughed as chains tightened the men who sold daughters and brothers as easily as tobacco. The men who believed themselves immortal because of their titles would eat, and in eating they would choke on their own arrogance. For Samuel, love had been brief, like a candle lit against the storm, but loss that stayed. Loss hollowed him out and filled him with something heavier than rage purpose. Every beat of the kitchen pestle, every slice of the knife against roots, was a prayer for Adira, a hymn to his mother, a covenant with the countless voices silenced before him. He was no longer just the cook of the Whitaker estate. He was a student of hunger, of weakness, of death itself. And in his silence he nurtured a garden of retribution, one that would take years to bloom, but when it did, it would blossom red as the flowers of the fig tree, red as the blood that had been spilled into the soil for generations. The kitchen that once seemed like a cage now became Samuel's cathedral of knowledge. After Miss Gertie collapsed by the oven, they strapped her apron on him out of necessity, not trust. No one expected the quiet boy to last, but he did more than last. He thrived. Not because the work was easier, it wasn't, but because he finally stood where fire and hunger converged, where power sat on porcelain plates. Each morning Samuel woke before dawn, the air still thick with swamp fog. He lit the first flames, stirred the first pots, and set bread to rise. But what he truly prepared were observations. He knew which guests asked for salt before tasting, which men coughed before meals, which women wrinkled their noses at garlic. He understood more than their tongues. He understood their bodies, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. But Samuel wanted more than memory. He wanted mastery. He began to read, not openly. An enslaved man caught with a book risked a whip, sometimes worse, but in shadows. When Whitaker's guests left pamphlets, cookbooks, or farmers' almanacs in their rooms, Samuel would slip them into his apron. He returned them before dawn, no mark left, but the words were already his. He read not just of recipes, but of remedies. Notes from physicians about digestion, from farmers about soil, from apothecaries about tinctures. He learned how foxglove could slow a heart, how castor beans could burn from the inside out, how belladonna could cloud the mind like fog rolling over fields. In the garden behind the kitchen, Samuel's education deepened. Most plantations kept herbs, mint for tea, rosemary for chicken, sage for stews. But Samuel added his own seeds, stolen from markets, pilfered from strangers, begged off field hands who knew secrets of the soil. He grew oleander, its flowers delicate, its leaves deadly. He grew hemlock tall and unassuming, whispering history of ancient philosophers forced to drink it. He grew nightshade berries, black and glistening like beads of morning. No one questioned him. Who cared what the cook planted behind the kitchen? To the Whitakers, it was parsley, thyme, dill. To Samuel, it was an arsenal. He tested carefully. A pinch of crushed seed slipped into leftover scraps given to the rats. They twitched and stiffened. A powder hidden in a discarded bone fed to a mongrel. The dog foamed, whined, and fell silent by morning. Samuel knelt beside each corpse, studying, memorizing. He noted not with ink, but with breath, whispering symptoms like prayers, swelling, vomiting, paralysis, silence. His experiments taught him timing. Some poisons struck too fast, drawing suspicion, others too slow, allowing a man to crawl to safety. Samuel needed precision. He adjusted like a composer, tuning his symphony. Not too much, not too little. Enough to silence, but not so much to scream. The enslaved began to notice Samuel's stillness, the way he whispered to himself near the hearth long after the fire dimmed. Some thought he was mad, others thought he was haunted. They weren't wrong. Samuel carried ghosts. His mother grinding herbs in the dark, Adira whispering about the sky, the boy who hanged himself in the barn after the master's daughter lied. He carried them all, and in carrying them, he sharpened himself into their answer. By the time he reached 20, Samuel had become indispensable. The Whitakers trusted him to serve visiting judges, ministers, merchants. They praised his oysters chilled to perfection, his pork stews rich with fat, his cakes moist enough to make women sigh. They boasted of him to neighbors as though his talent reflected their own greatness. Our Samuel, they said, as if ownership extended to the spirit that lived inside him. But Samuel was no longer theirs. Every smile he forced, every bow he offered was a mask. Behind it he built his archive 12 names, men who returned again and again to the Whitaker estate, men who had left scars on flesh and memory, men who had sold, whipped, branded, or mocked the enslaved. Each name Samuel paired with a weakness, each weakness with an ingredient. Judge Hartley loved figs, he would die by figs. Reverend Cole adored cream, he would drown in it. Edwin Whitaker devoured fatty pork, he would choke on it. The ledger lived inside Samuel, indelible as scars. Outside the kitchen, the world shifted. Charleston bustled with trade, white men boasting of liberty while buying and selling human lives. Fireworks crackled each summer, marking Independence Day. Samuel watched them from the kitchen doorway, sparks of light bursting over a city built on chains. The irony seared him deeper than any lash. Freedom celebrated by men who denied it to others. But Samuel was patient. He understood that freedom was not always won on battlefield. Sometimes it was simmered, brewed, and served in silence. Years turned like millstones. Samuel's garden grew thicker, his skills sharper. The enslaved whispered legends about him, that he could cure fevers with a glance, that he could kill with a breath. They weren't entirely wrong. Samuel had become both healer and executioner, inheritor of Nifula's wisdom, twisted by the cruelty of Charleston. At night alone by the fire, he rehearsed in his mind the ritual that would one day come. He saw the table set, the glasses raised, the forks poised. He imagined the silence that would fall heavier than gunfire when men who laughed at chains tasted his justice. It was not rage that fueled him anymore, it was discipline. Rage burns fast, discipline endures. He touched the pouch buried beneath the fig tree, the one he had filled the day Adira was sold. 10 years had passed, and still he visited it. The bark had darkened, the roots had grown deep, and in its shadow Samuel made his final vow: they would eat, and in eating they would remember. Not just him, not just Adira, but every soul buried in unmarked graves, every scream smothered by Charleston's polite society. By then, Samuel was no longer the frail boy who arrived on a slave ship. He was a man forged in smoke, tempered by silence, armed with memory. To the Whitakers, he was still invisible. To himself, he was something else entirely, the quiet architect of a reckoning that no chain, no whip, no master could stop. And so, while Charleston slept, Samuel studied. While they toasted liberty, he whispered names into the fire. And while they believed themselves untouchable, Samuel planted poison in the soil, patient as the rice that grew in their fields. The kitchen was not his prison anymore. It was his battlefield. By the time Samuel's hair had begun to silver at the temples, his mind was sharper than any blade. He had not wasted a single year. Each day that passed, each dish he prepared was another step in a long procession toward reckoning. He had studied the Whitakers and their circle of power until their secrets were written across his memory like scripture. 12 names, 12 men who would never see their deaths coming. This was not a list scribbled on paper, but a litany recited in silence night after night like prayers twisted into curses. Each name carried not just a man, but a history of cruelty. Each entry in his ledger was more than a target, it was a judgment. The first was Judge Hartley, a man who cloaked himself in law while denying humanity to the enslaved. He had once ruled that a young girl barely 15 invited her own suffering by refusing an overseer's advances. He smiled when he spoke the words. His favorite indulgence was candied figs, soaked in brandy until they glistened like amber. Samuel decided Hartley would die by figs, their sweetness disguising the bitterness of foxglove. Then there was Reverend Cole, who shouted salvation on Sundays and swung whips on Mondays. He claimed shellfish gave him visions, but cream was his obsession. Oyster stew, thick with cream, was his joy, his pride. Samuel folded castor bean extract into that very cream, knowing the Reverend's last prayer would curdle in his throat before heaven could hear it. Master Edwin Whitaker himself was on the list. The man who laughed as the whip cracked, who had sold Adira without flinching. Edwin's liver was failing, swollen from drink and gluttony. He loved pork belly glazed until fat dripped down his chin. Samuel planned his dish carefully, pork belly laced with crushed oleander leaf, its bitterness hidden in grease, its poison sliding into blood like a whisper. There was Mr. Lambert, whose breath reeked of bourbon and cruelty. He once broke a man's ribs for singing too loud in the fields. Lambert's drink was rye, whiskey, smoky and strong. Samuel slipped aconite into it, a toxin as subtle as regret, burning him from the inside out. Colonel Wexley, who spat tobacco onto the backs of kneeling men, would die with tobacco in his mouth. His cigars, laced with monkshood, became his own gallows. He would never finish that final puff. Mr. Bryce, the banker who bought children like cattle, believed himself refined. He insisted on milk with every meal, despite the way it twisted his stomach. Samuel granted him that indulgence, adding belladonna until his veins carried visions darker than nightmares. He died not in wealth or dignity, but in filth, hunched on a privy. Nathaniel Beach, the drunkard who branded women for sport, would meet hemlock hidden in his wine. Dr. Miles, who swore that black flesh felt less pain, would find the irony of medicine turned against him, his final dose brewed from the very herbs he dismissed as superstition. Wesley Grant, the slave catcher, would drink his last toast with poison clinging to his cup like shadows. Charles Tilling, the whisperer who sold secrets for coin, would find no words at the end, his throat silenced by ground roots. Each man's death was not random. It was choreography, a requiem composed plate by plate. Samuel saw himself less as a cook and more as a priest conducting a dark communion. Bread and wine had always been symbols of sacrifice. He would twist them into symbols of justice. And so the menu was written in silence, the table set for judgment. It was the 4th of July, 1833. Outside, Charleston was alight with fireworks and brass music, the city boasting of freedom bought by chains. Inside the Whitaker estate, the dining hall glittered with chandeliers and silver. The long table gleamed under candlelight, lined with 12 men dressed in fine linen, their pockets fat with the labor of others. Their laughter filled the air, rich and arrogant, as violins played faintly from another room. In the kitchen, Samuel prepared. He rose before dawn, hands steady, heart hollow. Each dish had been chosen with precision. The pork belly for Edwin glazed and caramelized until the air itself grew heavy with its fat. The figs for Judge Hartley, shimmering with syrup darkened by foxglove. The oyster stew for Reverend Cole, steaming like salvation dressed as doom. Whiskey, wine, cigars, cream milk, all transformed into chalices of reckoning. He laid each plate as if performing a ritual, polishing silverware until it shone like judgment itself. To anyone watching, he was the same loyal cook he had always been, invisible, obedient, silent. But Samuel knew, the ancestors knew, the spirits buried in unmarked graves knew. Tonight the balance would shift, if only for a heartbeat. As the guests gathered, Samuel stood in the doorway framed by firelight. He did not smile from joy, but from inevitability. The world had finally come full circle. He served them each plate with the grace of a man carrying more than food. He bowed as he always did, though in his heart it was no bow of servitude but a final farewell. To freedom, one guest shouted, raising his glass. To the American spirit, cried another. Crystal clinked laughter, echoed silverware, struck china like tiny bells. They believed they were celebrating liberty. In truth, they were tasting their last supper. Samuel moved silently, his steps measured like the ticking of a clock counting down. No one noticed the flicker in his eye, the steadiness of his hand. They ate greedily as they always had. At first, pleasure, salt sweetness, fat melting on tongues, then silence. The kind of silence that seeps into a room like smoke. It began with Hartley. His fork slipped his lips, foamed his eyes, rolled back as if something ancient had reached for him. The Reverend followed, clutching his gut, knocking over his wine, his prayers drowned by bile. Edwin Whitaker wheezed, sweat slick on his face, reaching for water that never came. One by one they broke their bodies, betraying them their power, shriveling with each spasm. Chaos erupted, chairs, scraped men, shouted some, crawled some, vomited blood into embroidered napkins. But Samuel stood still by the hearth, framed in fire as if he had been carved from stone. He had prepared this night for 20 years, and now the feast was finished. The dining hall of the Whitaker estate had never seen such chaos. Where once there had been toasts and arrogant laughter, now there were screams retching the frantic scraping of chairs across marble. Silver goblets tipped spilling wine that mixed with bile on the polished floors. Candlelight flickered wildly, throwing grotesque shadows on the walls as 12 men, the pillars of Charleston society, collapsed like marionettes whose strings had been cut. Judge Hartley stiffened, first spoon frozen midair, then slumped into his figs, syrup clinging to his lips like mockery. Reverend Cole moaned, his voice rising like a hymn, turned to agony before crashing backward in his chair. Edwin Whitaker, lord of the plantation, clawed at his throat, his swollen body convulsing as he toppled face first into the pork belly he so adored. Colonel Wexley staggered, coughing blood into his fine linen collar. Lambert vomited a dark stream as he crawled toward the porch, only to collapse halfway, his body hanging between inside and out as though even the house rejected him. The air filled with stench, sweat, vomit, blood, and something heavier, retribution. Through it all, Samuel stood by the hearth, unmoving. His apron was still tied neatly. His hands bore no blood. He looked not at the dying men but at the fire, as though he were waiting for it to acknowledge him. A guest pointed a trembling finger. "You, what did you?" Samuel turned, eyes calm, voice low. "I remembered. Nothing more. Yet it was enough." Every man in that room felt the weight of generations in those two words. Outside, the musicians stopped playing. A scream carried through the corridors. Servants huddled in doorways, eyes wide but mouths shut. For the enslaved, no words were needed. They had seen what lay on the floors, what choked the throats of men who once called themselves gods. Their silence was not fear, it was recognition. By dawn, the constables arrived. Boots echoed down the marble halls. They found Samuel still standing, apron unsoiled, as if he had been awaiting their arrival. The bodies lay around him, grotesque monuments to indulgence and cruelty. The deputies gagged at the stench, one muttering about sickness, another refusing to look at Samuel's eyes. The constable asked directly, voice strained, "Did you do this?" Samuel did not answer. He did not need to. His silence was thunder. Dragged through the very halls where he had once carried platters of roast duck, Samuel was shackled and led to Charleston's courthouse. The building loomed like a cathedral of hypocrisy, its white columns gleaming, its bricks soaked with unspoken history. Crowds filled the benches, landowners, overseers, curious townsfolk, even housewives in mourning veils. They came not for justice but for spectacle, to see the enslaved cook who had dared poison the untouchable. The prosecutor painted Samuel as devilish, possessed, inhuman. Premeditated murder, he spat. 12 honorable men cut down in a single night. Coroner's notes were read aloud, trembling documents that described symptoms but never dared to name poison outright. No explanation could satisfy. How could 12 men collapse in one night by coincidence? Some whispered of witchcraft, others of the devil himself. But deep down, everyone knew Samuel had walked into the kitchen, and 12 men had not walked out. Witnesses were brought forward. The maid said he was too quiet. The stable boy claimed Samuel was odd, always watching. A field hand admitted hearing him whisper names into the dark. Even the butcher, drunk on his own authority, muttered that Samuel was too smart for his skin. All spoke, but none could prove. Still, proof was unnecessary. Samuel's silence was its own verdict. When the judge demanded a confession, Samuel sat straight-backed, eyes fixed forward as if the room was unworthy of acknowledgement. When offered a priest, he turned away. When shown blood-stained aprons laid on the floor like bodies, he did not blink. One juror wept when the sentence was read, not for Samuel but for the world cracked open by his act. Guilty. Death by hanging. To be carried out publicly as an example, they said, so others would learn the cost of vengeance. But they were wrong. Samuel had not acted for vengeance. He had acted for remembrance. The crowd craved some display, rage, sorrow, a plea for mercy. Samuel gave them silence. And in that silence the air grew heavy, as if each soul in that room suddenly heard the whispers of their own sin. As guards moved to take him away, the judge leaned forward, asking the question none dared: why? For the first time in days, Samuel lifted his eyes. His voice was low, but it carried through the chamber like smoke, so they would never feel safe again. The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Mothers in the gallery clutched their children tighter. Landowners shifted uneasily. Overseers glanced at one another, their arrogance curdled into suspicion. Because Samuel had done more than kill 12 men. He had poisoned trust itself. On the morning of the 5th of July 1833, Charleston's courthouse square filled with bodies. Lanterns glowed in windows, faces pressed to iron railings. Merchants loitered with wagons. Children perched on shoulders, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. A preacher clutched his Bible in one hand, the noose in the other. The crowd buzzed like flies over carrion. At the center stood Samuel, dressed in coarse white cloth the guards insisted on for decency. His wrists were bound, but his posture remained unbowed. There was no fear on his face, no shame, only stillness. The sheriff climbed the steps, slowly, boots heavy with ceremony. The rope swayed gently, creaking like an instrument waiting to play its final note. The sheriff's voice wavered as he declared the sentence. Gasps rippled, curses, hissed nods of approval followed. The fig tree near the square rustled as though applauding. Samuel refused the hood. His eyes stayed visible, piercing through the crowd unbroken. He carried in them the ghosts of his mother of Adira, of every nameless soul buried beneath the soil. "Make peace," the sheriff urged softly. Samuel lifted his chin, whispering words the wind carried to every corner of the square. "I have." The trapdoor opened, the noose tightened, and for a moment Samuel did not fall. He rose. Like a spirit unshackled, a bird freed a memory that refused erasure. Then gravity claimed him and the square fell silent. But silence is not always absence. Sometimes, silence is a legacy. They buried Samuel in a shallow grave just beyond Charleston city. Limits no marker, no prayer, only dirt pressed down as if to erase him. But erasure was impossible. Word spread quickly, first in the quarters, then along the rivers, carried on whispers faster than the overseer's whip could silence them. In Louisiana, enslaved cooks spoke his name while stirring pots. In Virginia, mothers braided his story into their children's hair. In Georgia, a boy carved 12 initials beneath the sketch of a noose. Samuel was gone, but Samuel had become legend. The white elite told his story too, though never in daylight. In parlors, they lowered their voices, speaking of poisoned figs and milk turned fatal. They suspected their own cooks, mistrusted their own meals. The kitchen, once the safest realm of luxury, became haunted. The true poison Samuel had served was not in herbs or powders, but in fear itself. Fear that no chain, no lash, no law could keep a man truly invisible. And then there was the fig tree. The spring after Samuel's death, its blossoms turned deep red, though no one watered it, though no one tended its roots. Some said the soil had drunk too much blood. Others whispered it was Samuel himself, reaching upward, refusing to be silenced. Samuel did not live to see freedom, but he left something sharper. He proved that memory could be a weapon, that silence could rattle an empire louder than muskets, that a meal could become judgment. His story is not one of revenge, but of remembrance. An inheritance carried by those who endured. And now, when we raise a glass, we must ask what was paid so we could toast. Whose cries became seasoning, whose lives were swallowed at the table of history. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it so others may hear the truths that never make it into the history books.